Tyler Graham wasn't your average weekend hunter. He'd grown up in the wild backwoods of Oregon, raised by a grandfather who taught him that silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. Over the years, Tyler had hunted everything from elk to bear, often alone, and always deep in the wilderness where GPS failed and radio signals died. His respect for nature ran deep, but so did his hunger for isolation. He didn't hunt for trophies. He hunted for peace and something else he could never quite name. This trip, however, felt different from the start. It wasn't the usual trails he loved, nor the familiar comfort of Pine Ridge or Hollow Creek. Tyler had heard whispers of a stretch of forest called Deadman's Hollow, a place even veteran hunters avoided. Stories drifted through town like smoke, tales of vanishing hikers, strange lights, and sounds that mimicked human voices. Locals warned each other in hushed tones, but no one could ever offer proof. Tyler dismissed it all as superstition. After all, fear was just another kind of silence, and he wasn't afraid of silence. He packed light, a lever-action rifle, a hunting knife, 2 days' worth of jerky and water, and his grandfather's old compass, more reliable than any modern gadget. Before leaving, he scribbled a rough map of the area using scraps from an old forestry chart. At the edge of the trailhead, the trees looked darker, older. Their limbs stretched out like crooked arms, as if warning him not to enter. Tyler didn't hesitate. He pushed through, feeling the cold snap of wind against his neck, and disappeared into the trees. The first day was uneventful, almost disappointingly so. The forest was oddly quiet, no birdsong, no rustling underbrush. Even the squirrels seemed to be keeping their heads down. Tyler chalked it up to the cold front that had moved in, but something about the silence gnawed at him. It wasn't the peaceful kind he enjoyed. It was a heavy kind of silence, expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. By nightfall, he'd set up a small camp beside a dry riverbed and lit a fire. The flames crackled, but they didn't chase away the feeling that he wasn't entirely alone. Lying in his tent, Tyler stared up through the mesh, watching the stars barely twinkle between the tree branches. That's when he noticed something unsettling. In all his years in the wild, he'd learned to recognize the rhythm of the woods, the shift between night predators and morning birds, the distant howl of coyotes, the flutter of wings. But tonight, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just an unnatural stillness, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. And though Tyler wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, that night, he kept the rifle within arm's reach. Safety off. By morning, the air had turned colder than expected. Frost clung to the edges of Tyler's tent and coated the leaves like a thin layer of crystal. As he packed up camp, he noticed deer tracks nearby, faint but fresh. The hunt was back on. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, took a sip from his thermos, and set off deeper into the woods, following the trail with the trained eye of a man who had done this 100 times. The prints curved eastward, away from the dried riverbed, into a part of the forest even less traveled. There was no marked path, but Tyler trusted his gut. That morning, it was telling him to keep going. Roughly 2 miles in, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their limbs gnarled and knotted, casting jagged shadows across the ground. Moss hung heavy from the branches, and strange clusters of mushrooms peeked through the underbrush in odd, unnatural patterns. The deer tracks suddenly stopped. No turning, no scatter, just stopped. Tyler knelt, brushing away the leaves. In confusion, nothing. No signs of struggle. No scent trail, not even a broken twig. It was like the animal had simply vanished into thin air. That was the first moment he felt it again, the unease crawling back up his spine. He pulled out his GPS unit to check his coordinates. But the screen flickered, then went dark. Dead battery, maybe. Or something else. He tried his backup, a satellite-connected watch he'd used for years, but it refused to load. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He wasn't lost. Yet the compass still worked, and he had the rough map in his coat pocket. Still, the technology failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was strange. He looked up through the trees, suddenly aware that the sun had slipped behind a curtain of gray clouds, dimming the forest around him. Still determined, Tyler pressed on, ignoring the twisting in his gut. Every instinct told him to turn back, not because of danger, but because of something else, something unseen. But that same instinct, the one that had kept him alive in the wilderness for years, also whispered curiosity. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was the stories he'd once laughed at. Maybe, deep down, he wanted to prove them wrong. Either way, he kept moving. Every step off the known trail was a step into a place few had dared walk. The terrain grew more uneven, forcing him to climb over fallen logs and navigate around thorny thickets. Then, through a gap in the trees, he spotted something ahead. A dry, narrow clearing, surrounded by dense bushes, far too symmetrical to be natural. At the center, the dirt looked disturbed, as if something had been dragged or buried. Just beyond that, barely visible through the foliage, was a dim, flickering light, pale blue, almost metallic. It wasn't sunlight, and it wasn't fire. Tyler crouched low, squinting toward it. It was still far, but definitely real. His heart began to pound. Not from exertion but from something deeper. Tyler crouched behind the thick brush, barely breathing. The light ahead wasn't moving, but it seemed to pulse, not like a flickering flame, but in a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. It was cold and blue, unlike any flashlight he had ever seen. He narrowed his eyes and tried to reason with himself. Maybe it was a camper with some weird new gear. Maybe it was a drone, someone lost. But none of that made sense. Not this deep in the forest, not where no trail lead, and definitely not in the middle of Deadman's Hollow. He slowly reached for his rifle. Not to use it, not yet, but for the comfort of it. The metal felt colder than usual in his grip. The clearing was just 20 or 30 feet ahead, but every step toward it would mean exposing himself. He waited, watching. The light didn't change or grow. It stayed exactly where it was, glowing softly behind the bushes. The forest, however, seemed to grow darker. Clouds swallowed what was left of the daylight, and the temperature dropped fast. The wind stilled, and the only sound left was the faint electric hum coming from the direction of the glow. Unable to resist, Tyler began to move, inch by careful inch. He crept low to the ground, sweeping his boots silently through the leaves. As he reached the edge of the bushes, he could finally see more clearly. His heart skipped. In the middle of the clearing was an object, metallic, oval-shaped, and half buried in dirt. It was no cabin, no tent, no hunting equipment. The surface was smooth but weathered, like it had been there a long time, yet the light it emitted was modern. Or futuristic. The blue glow came from thin lines running across its shell, pulsing softly like veins under skin. Tyler's breath fogged in the air. He could feel something, a vibration, maybe faint, running through the ground beneath him. He adjusted his grip on the rifle. Inside the object, he saw something move, not clearly, but enough to know it wasn't empty. The motion was slow, deliberate. A shape, tall, thin, humanoid. But the proportions weren't right. The limbs were just a little too long. The head moved, not like a curious person, but like an animal sensing heat. It didn't look out at him, not yet, but he had the horrible feeling that it knew he was there. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. His survival instincts screamed at him to run, but curiosity, that dangerous, human weakness, held him frozen in place. The rifle suddenly felt useless, like a toy. What was he even looking at? A secret military craft? Some sort of experimental technology? Or was it something far older or not from here at all? Then, without warning, the light began to dim. Not flicker dim, as if it sensed him watching. The shape inside tilted its head slowly, ever so slightly, and Tyler's blood turned to ice. Time seemed to slow around Tyler as he crouched at the edge of the clearing. His body locked in place by sheer instinct. The dimming light from the pod wasn't just a visual change, it felt like the entire forest reacted to it. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something unfamiliar, something metallic and almost electric. Tyler's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as he stared at the shape inside the craft. It had turned toward him now slowly, deliberately, as if it had always known he was there, and was simply waiting for him to notice. The creature, if that's what it was, stood motionless just beyond the glass-like material of the pod. Though the visibility was low, Tyler could make out its silhouette. Humanoid, yes, but wrong. Too tall, too narrow. Its arms hung just a little too long, and its head was elongated. The top sloping back as if built for a different kind of brain. No facial features were visible, but a pair of glowing white slits where eyes should have been pulsed once, in sync with the pod's fading lights. Tyler's instincts were screaming now. He'd encountered bear, cougar, even a wolf once. This was not that. This was something outside the food chain, something watching. He dared not move. Every sound in the forest had vanished, even the wind. The quiet was total, absolute, like he had stepped out of time. Tyler's fingers tightened around his rifle, but his brain knew better. A weapon designed for deer wasn't going to help him here. He glanced left, then right, slowly trying to find an exit route, but the undergrowth behind him now looked thicker, darker, like the forest itself was closing in. And that was when he noticed the second shape, smaller, crouching low to the ground just behind the pod. This one was partially obscured by shadow, but he could see it shift, not standing like the first, more animalistic in posture. Its limbs were longer and seemed to bend backward, like an insect's. It didn't have eyes, not that he could see, but it moved with confidence, like it didn't need to see. Tyler flinched, and a branch beneath his boot cracked. Instantly, both figures froze. The lights on the pod blinked out. Silence slammed back into place, like a trap springing shut. Tyler's skin turned cold. His breath caught. For the first time in years, he felt truly hunted. Suddenly, the clearing no longer felt like open ground. It felt like a cage. Tyler remained, crouched for a moment longer, torn between retreat and whatever primal part of him still wanted answers. He was no longer certain if what he'd seen was mechanical, biological, or some twisted mix of both. The shapes didn't move. Neither did he. But deep in his chest, his heart thundered so loudly he feared they'd hear it. He slowly, carefully, began to crawl backward into the brush, never breaking eye contact with the pod. But as he slipped, behind the branches, he stepped into something cold and wet. Looking down, he realized the soil beneath him had turned to mud fresh, like it had just been disturbed. Tyler staggered back, his foot sinking several inches into the cold mud. He looked down instinctively, expecting nothing more than a soggy boot, but what he saw turned his stomach inside out. Next to his print, embedded deep into the wet earth, was another, but it wasn't human. The shape was massive, nearly twice the size of his boot, and ended in 3 long, claw-like toes. Each impression was unnaturally symmetrical, as if whatever left it moved with perfect precision. The spacing between prints suggested it had been walking on 2 legs, and recently, the mud was still pooling into the indentations, rippling, slightly, as though something had just stepped through. His eyes darted across the forest floor. More of the prints stretched out behind him, and ahead of him. They weren't scattered or random, they were leading somewhere. The direction chilled him to the bone. They curved in a wide arc that circled the clearing where the pod sat, and then pointed directly toward the spot where he had been hiding. Tyler's stomach dropped. This thing, whatever it was, hadn't just wandered through. It had been tracking him, watching, maybe even herding him toward the clearing on purpose. Tyler backed away slowly, forcing each breath to stay silent. Every step sank deeper into the mud, and the prints beneath him grew more frequent, overlapping his own, crisscrossing in unnatural angles. It was like the forest floor was telling a story he didn't want to read. Something had moved through this area with absolute control, and he'd walked right into its path. It hadn't chased him. It hadn't needed to. It was confident, patient, like a predator that had all the time in the world. And now, the hunter had become the hunted. He reached a denser patch of trees and ducked low behind a rotted trunk, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Somewhere behind him, a faint sound echoed, not a growl, not a branch snap, but something subtler. A clicking sound, rhythmic, repeating, almost insect-like. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from all around him, bouncing between the trees like sonar. He pressed his back to the trunk, barely daring to breathe. The light from the pod was gone, swallowed by the forest. All he had now was instinct and a terrible, growing certainty that he was not alone. In the mud, just a few feet from where he crouched, a new footprint appeared. Fresh, not stepped earlier. Now Tyler hadn't seen anything move. There had been no shadow, no flash, no blur. But the print was there, impossibly fresh, as though something invisible had just stepped forward. His vision blurred with panic. His ears rang. Every primal alarm in his body screamed that it was time to run. But still, he remained frozen because part of him now understood. This was no accident. He hadn't stumbled across something forbidden. He had been allowed to. Tyler didn't stop running until the forest began to thin, and the sky above him shifted from charcoal gray to the first pale hints of dawn. His legs were numb, lungs burning, heart punching against his ribs like a warning drum. Branches slapped against his arms and face. Mud weighed down his boots, and he didn't care. He just needed to get out, to reach his truck, to hear the sound of the engine, to see a road, a sign, anything human. When he finally broke through the tree line and spotted the faded paint of his old Dodge, he almost dropped to his knees. He fumbled the keys into the ignition, peeled out of the forest's edge, and didn't look back. For the next few days, Tyler said nothing. to anyone. He didn't tell his buddies. He didn't log anything on his hunting forums. When his neighbor asked if he caught anything, he just shook his head. How could he explain what he saw? Who would believe him? Not even he fully believed it. He tried to convince himself it was stress, a hallucination, maybe a gas leak near the clearing. The strange prints, the vanishing light, the clicking sounds, all part of a sleep-deprived delusion. But that night, lying in bed, something kept bothering him. A single, simple detail that refused to be ignored. The trail camera. He had strapped it to a tree 2 days before, right near the dry creek bed. It was motion-activated, the kind designed to capture wildlife when no one was watching. He'd forgotten all about it during the panic. He didn't even remember which direction it had been facing. Maybe it had captured nothing at all. But if that camera had seen what he saw, then maybe it could prove to him that he wasn't losing his mind. That it hadn't all been in his head. That the thing or things in the forest were real. Against every instinct screaming to leave it all behind, Tyler returned to the woods 2 days later. Not deep, just to the outer edge of the trail where he'd placed the camera. The light was broad and clean now, the forest less threatening, but still, a shiver ran down his spine as he stepped onto the trail again. The camera was still there, strapped to the tree, undisturbed. He retrieved it, heart pounding, and left without lingering. It wasn't until he got home, alone in his workshop, that he dared to check the footage. The device beeped softly as he scrolled through the clips. One by one, deer, raccoon, wind, more wind. Then, he froze. A clip from 2:14 a.m., the same night. The timestamp matched the hours just before he'd seen the pod. The image was grainy, night vision green, but it clearly showed him, Tyler, walking through the clearing, rifle in hand. That wasn't the part that made his blood run cold. It was what came after. Behind him, in the tree line, was a shape, a figure. No sound, no movement, just watching. It didn't glow, it didn't move, but its outline was unmistakable, and as the frames ticked by, it slowly began to shift, not toward Tyler, but around him. Always staying just out of sight. It had followed him. But that wasn't even the worst part. Tyler leaned in closer, to the small screen of the trail camera's display, his fingers trembling. The infrared video continued in complete silence. It was surreal, watching himself walk through that stretch of forest. Unaware, vulnerable, with something clearly watching him from the trees. Frame by frame, the figure in the background grew clearer. It remained partially hidden in shadow, but its outline betrayed a shape, not built like anything human. Narrow frame, long limbs, no clear face, but those glowing, faintly reflective slits where eyes should be. They weren't natural. They didn't blink like an animal's, they pulsed. Tyler scrubbed forward slowly, eyes wide, unable to look away. In one frame, the figure seemed to be behind a tree. In the next, it was gone, no movement, no transition, just vanished. Then, a few seconds later, another figure appeared on the opposite side of the screen, closer to the camera. This one was even less defined, barely more than a shimmer against the background. But when Tyler paused it, there was no denying what it was. A head, cocked at an unnatural angle, staring directly toward the lens. It was like it knew it was being watched, or worse, that it had allowed itself to be seen. He hit pause, rewind, pause, over and over. He couldn't make sense of it. There were no logical explanations. This wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't dust or mist. There were intelligent movements, calculated positioning. The camera wasn't just capturing wildlife anymore. It had captured something else, something conscious, something that had followed him without sound, without being seen, and for reasons Tyler couldn't understand, it had never tried to stop him. Not during the encounter. Not while he ran. Not even now. It had only watched. Patient, curious, unblinking. Then came the final clip, the last video file. No sound, just static for the first 3 seconds. Tyler was about to delete it, assuming it was corrupted, when the screen abruptly flickered to life. The shot was low to the ground, angled upward, like the camera had been taken off the tree, and placed intentionally. The forest looked different, deeper, and in the center of the frame stood a single tree. At first, it seemed unremarkable. But as the wind blew, Tyler noticed something hanging from a branch. A strip of orange fabric, the exact same kind from the vest he'd worn the night of the encounter. But Tyler had never walked that deep. He had never lost anything. The camera continued to roll for exactly 13 seconds. In the final frame, Just before the screen cut to black, a shape moved into the foreground. Not a full body, just a face. Smooth, featureless skin, pale and almost translucent. The eye slits glowed faintly, not threatening, not aggressive, but studying. The face tilted slightly, as if it were mimicking a human expression. Then the screen cut to black. Tyler stared at it for a long time. Not breathing. Not moving. Something had taken the camera after he'd left, something that had been closer than he'd ever realized. Tyler never returned to the forest after that. The trail camera now sits in a locked drawer in his garage, battery removed, screen shattered after a sleepless night and one too many drinks. He doesn't tell people what happened. Not because he's scared of sounding crazy, but because deep down, he knows someone, or something, is still out there, watching. Sometimes, late at night, he hears clicking sounds in the trees outside his window, rhythmic, repeating, just like before. And every time he tries to sleep, he sees that final frame, a face with no mouth, but eyes that never stop watching.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.